You're listening to Cinema Lab, a program of the Grand Rapids Community Media Center. Cinema Lab is an all-encompassing film network designed to engage our community in active viewing, appreciation, and understanding of the world of cinema. This episode of Cinema Lab is made possible by the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation. For more information about the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation, visit grplfoundation.org. Hello, listeners, and welcome, panelists, to today's episode of Cinema Lab. I'm Sarah Naraki, founder of Cinema Lab and director of Wealthy Theater, and with me today I have former WYCE station manager and local musician and music teacher Hayes Griffin. I also have Cinema Lab co-host and Wealthy Theater's front of house manager Caleb Dillon. And lastly, representing the Grand Rapids Public Library is Alan McCarty, who's also an expert in wilderness survival. Today, the four of us will be talking about Taika Waititi's 2016 film, Hunt for the Wilderpeople. And pro tip, this movie can be streamed for free on Canopy, which is a platform you can access with your Grand Rapids Public Library card. And of course, this being a movie podcast, be warned that we will be spoiling much of the movie. So if you haven't seen it yet, pause this podcast, hop over to Canopy, and then come back to us when you're ready. All right, now that the spoiler alert is out of the way, let's dive into the movie. Well, why don't we just kind of jump in and let's go around and just initial reactions to watching the movie. Did you guys love it, hate it? What'd you think about it? Feel free to jump in.
Well, hey, I'll jump in. I loved it. Incredibly, it was the first Waititi movie that I had seen. And it was one of those that I just could not believe that I hadn't seen before. I immediately texted my family and said, like, oh my God, we have a new, like, favorite family movie. Like, I can't believe that we haven't been watching this movie for the last 20 years and, like, quoting it and, just really enjoyed it and was all in on Waititi after that viewing.
Hayes, what'd you think of it? I know you're kind of new to Taika Waititi's stuff.
Yeah, this was pretty interesting for me. I naturally, like I said, based upon my background, my attention gravitates towards sound whenever I'm viewing things, which is, I guess, a curse and a blessing sometimes. But I really loved the use of sound and music in this film to kind of paint each of the characters and foreshadow some of the things that they were going to get into, not to kind of like put the cart before the horse here, but some of the things that we talked about before the podcast were kind of like some of the tropes or kind of stereotypical plot arcs that we see in this, the kind of like deserted island / castaway trope or the like coming of age story. And I think a lot of those elements were really fleshed out through the work of the composers in this film. Moniker is the name of the band that actually did the soundtrack and the score for this movie, but they're actually it involves three core members of a New Zealand indie band called the Phoenix Foundation. And I think if you listen to a lot of their music, like I kind of scanned through some of their albums after watching the movie and paired it with, kind of how the sound in the movie colored my view of the narrative. And it makes a lot of sense why they were chosen for this. Taika Waititi uses them in a lot of his other films as well. So yeah, those were the things that just popped out to me, but I thought it was a really tight, well-crafted score for the movie that helped flesh out the narrative.
That's awesome. And Alan, I want to hear a little bit about, do you have a background in film? Are you fairly well-versed or not at all? And also just kind of your perspective as being very connected with like wilderness survival and that sort of thing that we see in this movie.
Yeah. So I'll say that in that like kind of 8-year time frame of me working in the outdoors, I wasn't watching too many films with that, but overall I have watched a few of the films that he's done, specifically A Boy. I hadn't actually heard of this film before, so watching it was quite nice. I will say that I'm more definitely invested in films that kind of have a story or something that I can pull from it rather than just, say, watching content for content. So I actually really enjoyed this film because of that. dynamic of being in a wilderness setting rather than that typical, say, coming of age story of like household troubled things. It's like very much in a different environment than you typically find.
And I think that's something that Taika Waititi does really well in all of his movies. And even though What We Do in the Shadows doesn't necessarily, talk about wilderness survival per se, I think that he makes all of his films very approachable. Again, I'm not one for, seeking out a wilderness experience necessarily. Like, I love nature and all that, but I'm not climbing a mountain today. But even regardless of that, I still really enjoyed the story, and I think everyone can find something to identify with there, whether it's the essence of a coming-of-age story or, the family dynamic or an unlikely friendship or something like that. So let's kind of dive into some of the tropes that we see, and I know there's a couple here. Let's go with the most obvious one, though. The wild wilderness trope. What do you guys think it means, and what kind of purpose does it serve for this story in particular?
Well, I think that both of the main characters, being Ricky and Heck, are escaping something or unwilling to return to something or, find some kind of solace in being apart from society or apart from experiences that they've had in the past. So I think to both of them it represents the opposite of some sort of confinement or imprisonment or having to live under someone else's rules or under someone else's system of society.
I really like what you said there, Caleb, about that, and I totally agree. But I also like how the film, this is a stereotypical kind of trope type thing too, right? Where they'll take this two characters who have something strong like that in common, but then kind of frame them as the odd couple opposites at the beginning of the movie, which is totally here. Like Ricky Baker has nothing in common with Heck, seemingly, right? At the beginning of the film, Ricky's this, like kid from the city, right? He's not used to like being in the country or anything like that. He's really into Tupac and hip hop culture, and he wears a lot of like it's visually apparent in the clothing that he wears, that he's definitely more affiliated with like a city culture, hip hop culture, commodification kind of thing. And then Heck, is there in his like ripped jeans and t-shirt and everything. So looking at them through that lens, I found that pretty interesting too, and I think it goes to support that kind of trope, right?
Well, I think for both of them as well, like for Ricky, his street smart exterior is a front for deeper feelings, just like Heck's kind of gruff exterior, mountain man, stay away from me thing is just as much a front, and it's in that wilderness that they can both sort of eventually let that go or let their guard down and try to, for the first time maybe understand like who they really want to be, whether that's maybe a more sensitive kid who can enjoy something other than, city life or, this rough exterior or something, and same thing for Heck, someone who might actually get along with someone who's very different from him or someone younger than him and might learn something from that just the same way that Ricky does.
Now, one of the things that's interesting about this film with the wilderness survival kind of aspect, there's some parallels and differences to the similar idea of like a deserted island or a castaway kind of trope. And it seems to me that the wilderness trope is more a willingness to go there versus the castaway is this person randomly ends up there. And we'll get into how there are elements of both throughout this film. But Alan, I'm wondering if you can kind of talk us through more of that real life experience of the wilderness survival. Like, why do people seek it out? Is there, any kind of like spiritual awakening thing, any themes that we see in movies like this that you actually do get in real life? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. We've had this kind of like surge in, say, outdoor recreation and just participating in nature in general. A lot of people going to find that sense of place, essentially. I found myself teaching a lot of that sense of place activities over the last few years than I did at the beginning of it all. Just people wanting to find a grounding space somewhere. And I think that people seek out this wilderness, and that's wilderness recreation kind of started up in like the later 1800s, so pretty recently actually. People weren't going out into the mountains or things like that before then. It was mostly we got clear land for farming and be safe from predators. Now that we have this kind of very safe environment in a way that we've kind of created, since there's not really frontiers left, people kind of seek these experiences, in my opinion, to find their true selves, truly finding themselves. I can't remember who said this to me a number of years ago or where I read it, but it was a statement that just nature acts as a mirror to the self. And I find that when somebody is by themselves without any of this constant stimulus that we have around us, they're left with their thoughts. And so they have to come to grips with that. Not necessarily what everybody wants to do. I'm sure over this last few months of quarantine and stay at home, people have probably experienced something pretty similar to what they would if they were out in nature, where you have nothing but your mind. I don't know if that's quite what you were getting at, but
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a really interesting perspective, and I want to kind of add to that. You said there's kind of been a bit of a resurgence in this desire to, go in the wilderness and find that like alone time and that reflection. Do you have a certain time that you can kind of pinpoint? Is it like in the last decade or anything like that? Like where are we seeing this trend really kicking up?
I think actually what's interesting is probably like 2008, 2009 is when, say, like Alex Honnold burst on the scene for climbing. He brought a lot of things forward with just that in terms of exposure to that specific activity. And I think that helped open up the doorway to all these other kind of, lack of a better term, dirtbag activities where you're like living out of your van and you have like no money, so you're just doing this purely for the fun of it. Now I see it more as it's a potential career path. People are actually making livings at this, where you can climb or you can surf, you can do these things. So I think it's gone into more acceptance by, say, like sponsors and everybody else seeing that they can monetize this. So double-edged kind of like thing there.
Yeah, that's very interesting how it's shifted from originally more of that like spiritual awakening and now kind of monetizing it. But I guess that's the way things go, right? You're good at something, try to make money off of it. I think it's fascinating that you bring up that resurgence, and I was like crossing my fingers that you would say that particular year, 2008, because that was going along my theory. I noticed a bit of a resurgence too when I was working at a bookstore prior to being part of the media center. There seemed to be a lot of these wilderness books popping up and a lot of people coming in asking for some that were older, but there was just a period of time that it was a hot topic, not to be confused with the store. And it seemed like it was right around 2008, 2010, like give or take kind of 5 years around 2010. And I'm trying to figure out what is the like cultural influence that has had this ripple effect into this genre, not just movies, but, media, literature, that sort of thing too. And one of the classes that I've taught at Grand Valley is about exactly that, like finding, and Hayes too. Hayes has taught the music version of this class, and we find pretty significant things that happen in history, world history, or just in American society, and how it ripples out into arts and media, and you start to see kind of a cathartic way of talking about that in the media. And so it seems to me, post-2000, we've got, it's like we're losing the sight of the American dream. It's no longer the 80s, 90s, that kind of thing. So you're getting more counterculture going on in there. And then, of course, with 9/11, getting into wars with the Middle East, then we start to see some trends in movies of this survival mentality. And especially when we hit 2008 with the recession, that survival concept is a huge, huge theme. I mean, every movie was a zombie movie. And if it's not a zombie movie, it's a dystopian film. And then we kind of level it out with some stuff like Into the Wild came out in 2007, 127 Hours came out in 2010. Up, which we could talk about that being a wilderness survival film, right? That's 2009. So you can see how there's that ripple effect here. So I'm really glad that you brought that up and that we can understand that it's not just, oh, these movies are popular because they're popular. No, it's kind of talking about our society and what we're all going through. I want to jump back a little bit to the soundtrack of this movie, which I thought was really interesting. And Hayes, I want to hear what you thought. I love, in the beginning, we have kind of this like choir singing when Ricky is rolling up on the property in the cop car. And so I'm sort of expecting that the whole movie is going to be like that. And I know we've talked about Swiss Army Man and, you know, the role of that like choir style soundtrack throughout, or a cappella. So I was totally expecting that. But then we shift to, you know, pop music and 80s synth kind of stuff. And then there's like tribal drum beats in there. So tell us what was going on with the music.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a lot of the major elements that I picked up on in the film there. I think we can draw pretty... The one thing that I'll say about this score is that it's extremely, in my opinion, literal with its interpretation and kind of like the tools that it uses to support character development and moving the narrative forward. It uses, I don't want to say like stereotypical or anything because that makes it seem uncreative. The score for this film is extremely creative, but they use a lot of stock, quote unquote, tools like tribal drumming. Whenever you hear that really fast, like doom doo doom doo doom, you know, like there are all those things that kind of like build tension and you start to feel it kind of well up in your chest. It's always preceding some kind of tense moment in the film, like when Ricky, his first trip into the wilderness, you know, where he makes it 200 yards away from the house and like falls asleep like on the ground. You hear some of those sounds as he starts to kind of like graze the wilderness, you know, as he starts to develop a relationship with, they call it the bush, right? That's what they call it in New Zealand and Australia. So as he starts to develop that relationship with the kind of wild aspects of the film, you start to hear those sounds come into the film more. But when Ricky's kind of grappling with his like older identity, the one, you know, that involves him like vandalizing things and setting stuff on fire, you hear a lot of 80s kind of stereotypical electronic sounds, sounds that come from very specific pieces of equipment that came out of the 1980s, like the Roland TS-808, like drum machines, stuff like that. Samples that you would have heard on Tupac records. You know what I mean? Which is one of Ricky's kind of, that's like his hero, right? As he goes into the wilderness. And I think you could draw a pretty clear comparison with the kind of narratives that Tupac kind of puts forth in his music. Like he was dealing with an urban wilderness in the early 90s, right? On the West Coast with, like, talk about tumultuous times and the effects that they have on arts and culture in America. The early 90s in LA, late 80s, early 90s, that's when we're dealing with race riots, police brutality. Do any of these themes sound familiar, right? So I think there's an extremely clear relationship between those themes and how they're represented in the film that way.
Well, and not only that, it seems just from the couple of Taika Waititi films that I've seen, I think his personality kind of comes out into the movie too, of really idolizing Western culture in the 80s. I mean, in the movie Boy, you see that with the obsession of Michael Jackson and this, like, you know, American dream, perfect capitalistic kind of lifestyle that he aspires for. But I'm glad that you brought up the kind of 80s synth and instruments that we're hearing, particularly in this one, and the fact that he names his dog Tupac. But even when he's talking about different names for the dogs, he says Megatron. Isn't that the bad guy in Transformers, right? So
exactly.
Another throwback there. Yeah, so I thought that was really neat. Caleb, any thoughts on your end, especially having seen Boy and kind of comparing this, like, harnessing the 80s culture? Is there a reason that it works or doesn't work compared to if we had just utilized more modern music and that sort of thing?
Well, I feel like the soundtrack was all over the place, but in the best possible way. I didn't even really think about it until after watching the movie. It was just sort of, it flowed so well. I think that Waititi or his music supervisor, or both of them, just have a really good sense of how to throw those things out there, but somehow make them feel of one piece at the same time. I really hadn't thought about how the more electronic 80s music contrasts with the more acoustic or non-electronic stuff to kind of throw into perspective those two areas. And now that I'm thinking about it, I was thinking, well, one of the things the soundtrack did for me was remind me of how much I loved the album Songs of Leonard Cohen, because there's that great Leonard Cohen song, and it's during, I believe, that insane 360 shot that's like sort of a montage of everyone looking for them, and it's in the winter, and it's just the perfect mood for that shot, and that is a very acoustic, very, very organic song from a very organic artist. So I'm gonna have to go back now and really think about how those two styles of music and styles of production might have really commented on the kind of warring perspectives. I think that's great.
I guess we can jump now to talking about the more narrative aspect of this film and the different levels of conflict. And this might be jumping back to our, not elementary, middle school, high school English lessons, right, of basic storytelling, man versus nature, man versus man, man versus self, that kind of thing. With wilderness survival, and same thing with the desert island, the castaway thing, it's man versus nature is very apparent and kind of the topmost conflict. But what did you guys think about this story? Did it just focus on one style of conflict? Did we hit a couple of them? Are there, multiple stories for multiple types of conflict? What did we take away from the film?
As the film idiot and noob here, I'll say that I definitely saw a couple different threads. The one that kind of, and you were talking about thinking back to high school English and stuff like that. The thing that comes to mind for me is the Bildungsroman. Does everybody know about the Bildungsroman?
Refresh our memory.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a literary genre that focuses on some kind of moral growth or psychological growth from it's like the coming of age story. That's typically what people call it, is the coming of age story, and that's obviously with Ricky Baker's character, we're getting squarely into that territory. Now, in my opinion, they use other elements and tropes like the castaway thing that we were talking about earlier to kind of support this Bildungsroman kind of current throughout the film. I wonder if we would call that the main thread or whatever, but that's for you film experts. But I definitely noticed a coming of age story. That was the big one for me.
I would add that some of the bullet points that I took away from it was the contrast of urban versus rural, and extreme rural, because it seems like Heck and Bella are really off the grid. Heck talks about going into the bush and just abandoning all that. And it's like, well, aren't you already in the bush? I think they're completely, separate from everything. Whereas Ricky starts out, saying, oh, he can't wait to get back to the city, all this being outside, it's so boring, whatever. And I think that also plays into the young versus old aspect of their relationship. Childless parents and parentless children. Reluctant father figures, reluctant children, and then also the passage of knowledge from the old to the young that Heck may not have known that he had any interest in, but by the end of it, it seems like they're going to go off on whatever adventure they're going to go off on, and they've decided that's they're going to be self-sufficient with each other. versus the authority of, conforming to society in a city or in that sort of complex.
I want to piggyback off of one of the things that you said about the fact that they already live in the bush, and it's interesting to think that it only becomes a wilderness survival style movie when Ricky comes into play then, because it's just normal everyday life for Heck and for Bella. But yeah, it's interesting that you have a character just kind of thrown in, and that changes the dynamic of the story. And I think that we certainly could have had a separate story that's just some, I don't know, quiet movie about Heck and Bella and their life out there. And yeah, same situation. They'd probably still be hunting the wildebeests that are out in the woods and doing their whole thing, but it's not going to feel so much like this survival. Alan, I want to throw a question to you. It seems like from what Caleb said and the notes that I have in front of me, I listed like 3 to 5 things per conflict style, like man versus nature, man versus self. It seems like there are a lot of these narrative storylines and styles of conflict going on. Is that pretty common with wilderness survival, whether it's a novel, a movie, anything like that? And what are your thoughts?
In terms of just man versus wild, like those things occurring, I think there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, our kind of more primitive brain, I would say, that we've been programmed for centuries of doing, which is we're always in conflict against nature for some reason. And that's probably has to do with the fact that we have a brain that can plan ahead and we can see things. So that would mean like, hey, this lion or this bear I can see like a mile off, I can plan for that. That's a foreseeable thing. Whereas one in, say, like the bush right next to me that I can't see, that's death. And so I think that's where our brains have developed to the point where we see wilderness as a threat. Because all those things that are the unknown, those things that we can't see, that's what we're fighting against. And essentially, I think you can boil it down to just change at that point. Like, nobody wants to change. Everybody likes things being very much the same. As we've seen over the last couple of months, that change is something that everybody kind of gets fired up about. And so I think when you do remove yourself from those familiar settings that you see in this film, like, yeah, going out and living with Heck and Bella, that's probably pretty drastic from the urban center. I've personally had a few courses where you take urban kids or urban individuals or people who are just used to cities in general way out into the place where there's no cell phone service, there's no nothing. And yeah, those first, I mean, you sometimes have clients or students just walk off because they've had it in the first couple hours, and you got to pull them back. So I think it's this thing that's primitively in us that we're fighting all the time, and we just have to acknowledge that and be comfortable with it, of like, why do I feel uncomfortable, and move forward.
That's really neat that your experience with, giving people the opportunity to be uprooted from like the city life and throw them into a rural existence has some parallels to this film, in that what you're saying of some of them would just like try to walk away, walk out of it. So the movie is maybe kind of accurate. And that kind of brings me to another thing that I wanted to get into with wilderness survival, or even the castaway concept. This idea of wanting to be rescued versus not wanting to be rescued. I think that's kind of a theme that we could see with either of them. And with the wilderness survival, it seems like it's you either sort of create a paradise and create your new home, or you succumb to savagery. But just kind of backing up with that, do you want to be rescued or not? What do we think with Ricky's character? Does he want to be rescued? Does he not? Does it change? What do we see?
Well, I don't think that either of them are enthusiastic to return to society per se, but just because they've both had really bad experiences with that. In rewatching it, I had kind of forgotten that Heck's backstory, as I couldn't really remember, or I couldn't really tell if he was he'd done some time in jail.
Yeah, he committed manslaughter, I believe. Right, it was a drunken fight.
Right, but did he pay his dues and then leave society, or I couldn't remember if he was sort of like still wanted, or if they were just commenting on the fact that if he's caught, or if they're caught, they're going to assume that, because he's got this criminal background, that there's something nefarious going on.
I believe it was the latter. He thought it would look bad because he had a criminal record, that he was out in the wild with this child, who was quote abducted or whatever. That's what I took away from it.
Well, yeah, I think for both of them, then, Ricky comes to terms with the fact that a lot of his fantasy life is just that, and it's time for him to grow up and participate in a world that is a little more real, or more grounded in his own reality. And for Heck, it's the realization that just himself being alone is not the best way to do it. Whether that's a return to society, maybe not, but at least the first step is him acknowledging that spending time with another person is preferable to being himself out there alone.
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily wanted to be rescued from the way it looked. It looked like a lot of fun that they were having out there in the wilderness, the bush, versus the people that were scrambling around looking for them all. And I think it's interesting too, like the rescue versus unrescue thing too. It's like when they mentioned that they were in an area of over 1 million hectares, that's like almost 2.5 million acres. So it's like that's like 1 million more acres than the state of Delaware is. So it's like, in my mind, it's like, there's no way I'm going to find 2 people out there in the middle of that. It's like, it's crazy. So I think it's interesting that when they do kind of get caught and everything else, I feel like it's that point in the film where it's almost like they want to, or it's like that point of you need to go past what they've kind of, yeah. I don't know how to wrap that up.
Yeah, did anybody else, after watching this movie, Google Map New Zealand like I did? I've always been really fascinated with New Zealand, but this was finally the point where I was like, okay, wait a minute. How big is New Zealand? How big is it compared to, this area in the U.S., let's say? And how much of it is just untamed wilderness, and how much is cities? Totally fascinating.
So what's the answer? Is it like out of control, a whole lot of wilderness and a little scary?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
So it's kind of crazy to think that Ricky thinks he has a chance to escape, because it seems like no matter where you would go, then you're going to be landing in the wilderness. So he's inevitably going to be forced to face this man versus nature kind of thing, and then the man versus self journey of wilderness survival. That's cool. Let's see. Oh, one of the other things I wanted to talk about is that this film is partially considered a comedy, and I think Sam Neill in an interview said that the movie is a comedy. All the characters are, really funny except for one, being his character not funny. Do you guys agree that this film is a comedy? If so, how? Where do we see it?
I'm going to jump in and just get straight back to the soundtrack, because that's my area. I think that, like, I don't know if I would call the movie a comedy. It's hard to call it just one thing, you know what I mean? Because with all of these kind of complex elements that we're talking about in terms of character development, the Bildungsroman thing, the man versus man, all these kind of conflicts, I think the film focuses more on the conflict than it does the comical side of things, but it uses comedy in order to make the characters more relatable, in my opinion, which I think is a thread that you see in Taika Waititi's films all across the board, even the Thor Ragnarok thing. Like, Thor is arguably the, like, dopiest, like, most comical of those characters in the superhero films, right? Like, his movies always seem to get more, like, there are more jabs and jokes and weird things like that in there. So I think it makes sense that Taika Waititi makes heavy use of comedy in this film. And just look at the stark juxtaposition, like I said, between the kind of like hyper electronic 80s sounds and the acoustic sounds. Obviously they go to support the film, but the fact that the way that they're used and starkly juxtaposed, like when Heck and the Bush enter, it's more acoustic sounds. When Ricky comes in, it's all these electronic sounds. They use comedy and hyperbole in order to just kind of like create more of a magnetic force to draw you into the plot more that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say that the tonal shifts from emotions and genres are what really attracted me to this movie and to his other works. The fact that you can be laughing at some silly thing one moment and then immediately you've got a really, really heavy moment like Bella's death.
I was just going to butt in and say that. She plays that ridiculous...
It was heartbreaking. It was so bad.
And it's right after she plays that ridiculous birthday song for Ricky.
I know.
Right? Like, which like, I was in stitches, you know what I mean? I was like, this is hilarious. It's a like, terrible birthday song, you know what I mean? And they clearly frame it that way.
A terribly awesome birthday song.
I don't know.
That's something that I would write for a friend.
Listen to it this morning. It's pretty dope.
You know what I mean, though. Like they give it a poor execution in the film to kind of like highlight the campy, you know what I mean, nature of the tune, and then they like immediately hit you in the face with the sledgehammer of her death. You know, I totally agree with you on that.
Well, I think that is, I guess part of what's refreshing to me about this movie and about his other work is it's the genres and the emotions aren't telegraphed beforehand so much as you're just kind of on the ride with them. And it feels more real. At the same time that it can feel super silly and like a cartoon, it can also seem hyper real and just like really heavy, and it's just like that's his style of filmmaking, his style of storytelling is closer to what real life is like, as opposed to, hey, here's a movie, it's a comedy, great, let's laugh, okay, here's the difficult third act. It's like you don't know when that's coming. It could be any moment that something difficult comes up, or any moment that it veers into this cartoony slapstick thing.
I think we do have a couple other elements that give it a good nod to comedy, and this is definitely more of a dark comedy than, overt comedy. One of the things that kind of tipped me in that direction was just right off the get-go when we're in the bad egg sequence, when the police officer is explaining like all the crimes he's committed, and then we slide over to this like quick cut montage of Ricky doing bad things, even though some of them are just like kicking over a box or, something that's not really threatening.
Spitting.
Huh?
Spitting.
Yeah. Just like listing all these things that you'd think like, oh gosh, he's a terrible criminal, but it's just a kid being a kid. But the way that we do that like fast cutting feels very much like the style that we see with Edgar Wright's films, like Hot Fuzz, Shaun of the Dead, which is seen in other movies, but that's a good one for people to kind of understand what we're talking about there. So that like snappy pacing with that editing gives us kind of a relief, and it's almost like a quick setup and payoff, or setup and then the punchline feel just through the editing and the visuals. The other thing too, I really enjoyed the playfulness of the chapters and the title cards that came up throughout the film. With the epilogue included, there would be 11 of them, but not only just in the typography of it that it felt playful, but it gives this film almost like an episodic feel that makes it a little more digestible, or you just feel like you're on a journey, and it kind of helps you think it's not super serious. And episodic stuff, we see that like with TV, something that's not serialized. Episodic is like, if you think of, cartoons is a good place to go. You can just jump into any episode. There's the story it's contained. You don't really need to know much. You can hop around episodes. Serialized, you need to watch it all the way through to really understand the story. So even though this is a movie, you can't jump around like it's episodic. That style, doing the chapters, is sort of an homage to that mentality of watching it, let's remember it's lighthearted, it's a journey, here we go. So I really appreciated that. Another question for you guys. I was kind of thinking about that garage or shack that's outside that they hang out in, and I didn't really think much of it the first time I watched this, but then I watched Boy, where they have a similar setting of a garage where they hang out in. And I feel like there's more significance. And of course, I'm not from New Zealand or Australia, so I don't understand, what is normal. Like, do people usually hang out in this garage shack? Is that like the equivalent of a living room, a family room? But what do you guys think that space kind of represents?
Alan might have some stuff to say about this, but I see it as like the last point of departure from your world to the wilderness. You know what I mean? And maybe that's just my own personal experience because my grandfather was a farmer and a mechanic. We would always hang out in his garage, and that was the place where you craft things or repair things that you're going to use outside of that space. Do you know what I mean? It's like the prepping ground in some kind of way. I don't know if that is meaningful or valid in any kind of way, but that definitely, I always feel that whenever I see that kind of setting, so that's my initial reaction to it here.
It can't be, a random choice that Ricky burns himself in that space before he takes off either. As far as point of departure, that's where he makes the dummy of himself and leaves the note, accidentally burning the whole thing down.
Yeah, I don't know if necessarily the building has a lot of significance or anything. I will say that every single outdoor company does have a warehouse or something like that where you repair all your gear, you pack all your gear up, and you depart from it. And typically that's where you're going to find all the instructors hanging around having like a beer or two after the course is ended or before the course begins. So it is kind of like, yeah, I mean, growing up, I hung out in my dad's wood shops all the time or just like his garage, that kind of a thing. And so I think watching this film, I thought of that space as like, that was kind of like Heck's more domain, whereas Bella was kind of like the house. And then when Bella was gone, then kind of the garage or shack is all that was kind of left. Once that was gone, all they had to do was depart, kind of like, yeah, what Hayes was getting to there.
Yeah, I guess I kind of thought that it acted as a family room or the man cave or this, I suppose for lack of a better term, a sanctuary. It seems like the safe space. It's also where he's given his dog Tupac, and he says the line, "I don't think I've ever had a birthday or celebrated a birthday," something to that effect. So there's a lot of like good that happens in this space and a lot of acceptance and family building that goes on there. And I found it interesting that, let's see, we had so like the 10-minute mark is what we call the inciting incident for a film. It's usually something that sort of triggers this change and like propels the protagonist to go on their journey towards a central question. And when right before we get to burning down the shack, the inciting incident, you have this interaction with Heck and Ricky where Heck says, "Leave me alone." So Bella's dead. He's struggling. He doesn't want to deal with this kid. He never wanted to be a dad. Like, it's a reluctance of that too. And then Ricky goes into his bedroom and he hugs the hot water bottle. And with that, you have this kind of nursery-esque score that's playing in the background that definitely cues us in that he, even though he puts on a front that he doesn't need anybody, he doesn't need a family, whatever, heck the system, he actually does. And he was starting to get a sense of belonging and family with Bella, and he had never been needed or wanted, but now he finally is. So I think him like hugging that, and then she's gone, Heck doesn't want to be his dad, now he needs to kind of find his own belonging. So I see him burning this this garage, this sanctuary, this like representation of family and belonging. I feel like it's kind of like the phoenix rising from the ashes, like you got to burn it down to build something new. So that's kind of how I took it, aside from, of course, the plot device of like faking his death, which, by the way, when the chief of police comes along with the other inspector and she like, I don't know, wipes her finger on the ashes and sniffs it, and she's like, "This isn't a foster child." And he's like, "How are you sure?" And like holds
so
up the plate. Like, oh my God. I love it. I love it so much.
One of the best parts for sure.
Yeah. So any other thoughts on that, on the garage, the shack, that kind of kicking off the story?
No, but now I'm really interested, especially, I know we keep talking about Boy, but yeah, that was such a central part of that movie. I wonder if it's also because a lot of houses in rural areas in New Zealand are just super small. Like, they don't really have a living room per se.
Right, you have like the pole barn, and that's where you get everything done. I think that's kind of what Alan was getting at earlier too.
And climate-wise too, I mean, if the climate is such that it's like being outside most of the time is doable, you know, it's not something we would do in Michigan in January, but you know.
Well, why don't we kind of segue from this concept of the garage, the shack, to is this a coming of age story? Why or why not? How is it similar to other coming of age stories, or how does it not follow that kind of storyline? What do you guys think about that?
You heard me earlier. I already cast my vote. I think it is. And I think I backed it up with some of the stuff there beforehand. But there's a clear character transformation and accrual of knowledge, expansion of moral and philosophical views within Ricky throughout the film. So I think it would be hard to argue against the fact that at least that element is present if you don't want to call the entire film a coming of age story. But there is a coming of age story nested in this film if it's not entirely a coming of age story.
Right. And I think it's also just as much a coming of age story for Heck as it is for Ricky. Their stories are, their growth is dovetailing in a way where, you know, by the end of it, he's able to realize that, you know, he's not getting anywhere. He's not living the life he wants to live by being so isolated and insulated from everyone. Maybe it took this one completely unlikely person to bring that out in him, but, you know, they found each other and they're moving towards something that is different from what they've been doing for the last however long.
Yeah, I'd agree that is pretty much a great coming of age story with those elements, and yeah, just kind of like that companionship element overall. Just those like differences, polar opposite, just going through and under those extenuating circumstances, finding each other. Yeah, because I think right now too, it's like a nice kind of storyline or message that it's giving of like very different people coming together and finding that kind of love for one another. Yeah, because I think there's a lot of debating going on and things like that usually in our daily lives.
Well, yeah, and the wilderness setting lends itself well to that because, you know, you can live in a house with someone or with people and have constant distractions to keep you from actually interacting. But when it's you and another person and the wilderness, it's just you and that, like, you have to be together. You don't have all these things to say, oh, I got to go do this, oh, I got to go do that. You know, like it forces you to really interact in a way that you really can't with all those distractions and all the sort of modern technology and things.
I was going to say there, Caleb, that's probably why all adventure educators and outdoor like recreation instructors are required to take conflict resolution courses, because every single class you will have it. It's typically in the first week or the first couple days you have to mitigate conflict between people, because they're finding what they don't like about each other.
Well, before we wind it up here, I have another question for Alan. One of my favorite podcasts that I listen to, a movie podcast, is called Bad Science, where they analyze the scientific elements of a movie and tear it apart and tell you, is it accurate, is it inaccurate? And sure, it kind of spoils some of that suspense of disbelief with movies, but I don't know. I think it's cool. So we're going to pretend that we're on Bad Science right now, and you get to tell us about the accuracies or inaccuracies of kind of elements of survival in the wilderness. Is there anything that stood out to you of like, yeah, you wouldn't really do that, or, ooh, this was a smart move? Anything like that you saw?
Yeah, overall, I think every time that they were hunting a wild boar there, like, do not attempt that in the way that they did. So, like, I've done quite a bit of hunting in my life, and, like, that boar probably would have caused some serious harm to them in the way that they portray it. If anybody's watching or reading, like, do not approach a boar with a knife. Like, that will end badly. Beyond that, I think quite a lot of the things that they touch on are accurate. They're in a bush, kind of like rainforest environment there. So in terms of water, they probably had water. My only issue with that is like waterborne illnesses, very, very common. And so if they were doing like rainwater or the fresh streams, which you can typically find, they probably were okay. But that would probably be my biggest concern typically. Food, almost every kind of like survival area, if you know what's around you, such as like the character Heck probably did, you're always going to have food. It's not an issue. When I lived in like Arizona, where there's deserts and everything else, like there's a lot of food in the desert, which would be surprising. And like there's been instances where I would run out of stuff and you can find it pretty easily. And they had guns, so it's like them getting big game. It's like I can see those people surviving for a very long time. The fact that they had firearms. If I didn't have a firearm, it'd probably be a lot of moving around to get that. I will say that with how much they were moving, they probably had to drink probably a gallon or more a day. So that would be something to think about. Overall, I think those wilderness elements in this film just helped thematically. I don't think you should maybe pull anything out of that to utilize. I will say Ricky getting lost at the beginning too, that's very realistic, of people getting lost a short distance away from where they're comfortable or they know. I have unfortunately found people lost in the wilderness more than once, and then typically they are pretty close to a place they could have found themselves out of if they'd had a map or done any prior proper planning. The 3P thing that everybody goes over, just prior proper planning, tell somebody where you are and maybe leave a map. But yeah,
that's good to know. So absolutely we need to have a map and not just rely on Google Maps on your phone, because your phone's probably going to die. And Ricky is certainly very lucky that Bella finds him first when he tries to run away the first time, and he's acted like he's gone such a long ways, and she's like, oh, glad we found you, and then like points over to the house just over the hill, like, no, you didn't really get far. But then the second time when Heck finds him and Ricky is like running low on food and doesn't know where he's going and that sort of thing, what would have been something crucial for Ricky's survival in that instance if Heck didn't find him? Like, what are some things that you should focus on first? Is it building a shelter for surviving the night, or finding a fresh water source, or like what are a couple key things? I know we can't get super in depth, but what should Ricky have done?
Honestly, Ricky would have just, if somebody does get lost in that way, just stop moving. Stay right where you are. Maybe establish a shelter or something, some kind of signifier that you're there to people. When you're constantly moving, then what ends up happening is you have these search and rescue teams that go out and they kind of do this blanket thing starting where you were. If you're moving around all over the place, then you could be going the wrong direction. And that could be bad. The average human being can last only like 3 to 4 days without water. You can go quite a bit longer without food, somewhere around like 14, 16 days, depending on who you are. But yeah, so like as long as he had water and everything else, I would have said just stop moving. Get yourself something that you can put up for rain and everything else and wait it out. If for some reason you start running out of water, then that would probably be the concern, is finding that. Usually you can look for like animal behaviors, like tracks, that kind of thing. They'll usually lead you right to water at some point. Also, if you could have seen birds morning and night, they typically go towards water. So you can also look towards where they're flying. And a bunch of other little things, like if insects are swarming you, then probably water's close by, even though that's annoying. Yeah. Main thing is just water, then shelter. Fire, a lot of people, you can start fires with your hands, that kind of stuff. Bow drills, hand drills. Honestly, if I was to walk off into the wilderness with anything, it'd probably just be a tarp, because I'd find that most useful to myself. Like, I can use a rock as a knife. I can start a fire, find food and water. Just shelter is the one thing I'd want a little bit nicer than, say, sticks or branches.
Man, I feel like I really want to take a wilderness survival class. This is way
fun.
more than I knew, and I love it. I'm learning already. Well, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that insight. So as we kind of wrap up here, I'm going to ask you guys for recommendations in just a second, but any last thoughts about the movies, any other takeaways, anything you guys want to throw out there?
I'm not sure if I really have anything other than I was interested to learn that the source material for the movie is a novel by Barry Crump. I wasn't able to find out too much of how accurate it is. I'm assuming it was pretty heavily rewritten, but Barry Crump he's a household name in New Zealand, and it's one of those things where household name there, completely unheard of here. But he was a really prolific author of a lot of semi-autobiographical sort of comic novels based on his persona as a rugged outdoorsman. From reading about him, I sort of gathered that he's sort of like an Ernest Hemingway, Steve Irwin, Crocodile Dundee, like all in one over there. But just one of the most famous authors in the country there, and just kind of a wild man, just crazy kind of guy, and it just sort of like from the man's man culture of, that era of the sort of 50s through the 80s, and really representative of that, getting back to nature and self-sufficiency and taking care of yourself and being able to survive no matter what. Unfortunately, the library here doesn't have any of his books, but I guess if you did a little bit more digging, you could probably find some of them. The title of the book that this movie is based on is Wild Pork and Watercress.
And I wonder if that's something that we could put a request into the library and maybe get access to a book. I would imagine they...
Oh, with the Melcat system, yeah, for sure. Do an interlibrary loan.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thanks for that. I was going to bring that up, that it was based off of a book, so hopefully we can check that out at a later time and compare it to the movie. And if not, at least the movie was fun. It's a romp, lessons learned, and yet another great Taika Waititi film in his repertoire. So let's shift it to recommendations of what you guys think either someone should watch next or read next, or, if you want to get creative with an album they could listen to or a piece of artwork to look at. I don't care. Whatever it is, at least one recommendation. Who wants to go first?
I could say that right off the bat, I thought of Up because of the fact that some female figure unfortunately passes away so early on and causes your heart to break. And then
Spoiler
they kind of have
alert.
that. Yeah, sorry. And then they have that whole kind of like kid and grouchy kind of older male figure go off and have an adventure together. So that immediately came to my mind. But also just like book wise, I don't know why this book, but maybe it has to do with just loss of kind of like father figure, absence of father figure. So looking for kind of that support was that book, The Tender Bar by J.R. Morgan. I just, for some reason, that popped into my head of like somebody who goes and not necessarily the environment you think of, talking and learning things about life from. Beyond that too, I was just thinking like the movie Lady Bird, just because that's also like coming of age and has some kind of comedic effect with all that emotional heaviness.
Well, and Lady Bird is also available on Canopy, which I totally forgot to mention. That Hunt for Wilderpeople as well as Boy are available on Canopy, and that's a platform that you have access to for free through your library card. So absolutely check that out. And there's a whole plethora of fantastic films on there. I know Caleb can definitely speak to it. But yeah, those are some really good choices. Up definitely came to mind for me, and I haven't read that book. I'll have to check it out. Hayes, what do you have? What recommendation do you have for us?
So there are a couple things that I wanted to kind of recommend. Going along with the theme of this movie, for some reason, a really like kind of instrumental book in my young, teenage life or adult life or whatever was the book Hatchet by Gary Paulson, which I see a lot of connection to this book and the film, mainly because it's like wilderness is forced upon a kid who doesn't really want the wilderness to be forced upon him. You know what I mean? So Hatchet was definitely a window into that world for me as a young adult. So I appreciated that one. Would definitely recommend it to anyone out there. And you were also talking about Canopy as a platform, and that you can access through the Grand Rapids Public Library. And another resource that I always say, regardless of whether it has anything specifically to do with what we're talking about or not, is the free access to lynda.com through the Grand Rapids Public Library. If we're talking about learning new skills, accruing knowledge that can help you in your future lives, lynda.com is a huge resource. It is ridiculous that anyone with a library card can get that for free. It costs tons of money to buy your own subscription. I'm learning how to code on there right now, but there are like music lessons, video editing lessons, audio production lessons, podcasting lessons, all those kinds of things on there. So would definitely throw my support behind the Grand Rapids Public Library's access to lynda.com.
I'll second that one too. It's amazing, all the different things that are available through the library, and you guys are adding more and more all the time. So I am forever grateful for the resources we have with the library. It's not just checking out books. You can do a lot of stuff online for free too. All right, Caleb, what do you have for us?
Well, I'm glad that Hayes mentioned Hatchet. I was going to say, for all the 80s kids listening, man, oh man, I mean, my whole elementary school life, it was Hatchet, it was My Side of the Mountain, it was The K, Island of the Blue Dolphins, like so many books that we read in that era. There was just such a push for that, which I wonder if there's any kind of parallel with those books' popularity in schools and what you were talking about, Sarah, with the push for wilderness-based or back to nature things when we hit, full internet saturation in the late 2000s. But I was going to say that some of those too, I never realized as an sixth grader in 1989 or whatever, reading these things, that some of them were written in the 60s or not of the period, and it never occurred to me. It never seemed to me like, oh, I'm reading this book that's, from some completely different era. Like, I can't relate to it at all. I think they're classics for a reason, is because they're not tied to any specific time period. I mean, any kid from any era can get lost out in the woods. And I think maybe the only difference now would be, well, do you have a phone or do you not have a phone? But take the phone away, and then he's the exact same as a kid lost in the woods in 1965. So a lot of those I would recommend. All those classic books are available at the Grand Rapids Public Library. There's also, speaking of working at a bookstore days, one of the perennial requests was kids coming in and parents coming in looking for survival guides, outdoor guides for their young children that were specifically aimed toward them, as opposed to an adult survival guide. There's the Ultimate Survival Guide by Mike Flynn, was one of the favorites back then, and I know the library carries that. The Pocket Guide to the Outdoors by Gene Craighead George, who wrote My Side of the Mountain. And then there's the Survive In series by Chris Bauman. It's survive in the desert, survive in the rainforest, it's a whole series specific to those sorts of environments. And those are all really good. They can be appreciated from any perspective, but especially like a young teen who's just sort of getting into this kind of stuff. Those are all great resources. Movie-wise, I was absolutely going to bring up Edgar Wright, because obviously a lot of Waititi's influences are the same as Wright's, and some of the quick cuts and some of the style of comedy are really spot on as far as a companion to, if you like Waititi's movies and you've seen all of them, and there's still some Edgar Wright movies you haven't seen. See all of those. Same thing. I mean, there's not a low point in either of their filmographies, but Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim, you're going to appreciate the same kind of style of rapid fire comedy, but also a lot of heart and a lot of depth to the story as well. And can't not plug enough Waititi's Boy, his second film from 2010 that I know Sarah and I just watched recently, and I was completely blown away by. It's the best movie that we didn't have in the 80s. Like, it should have come out in about 1986. Where it's like, we need one more great thing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know we've really sold it to go watch Boy, but man, that movie is it's so fun. It's good for all ages. It's the kind of thing that adults can take away one thing, kids might take away something else from it. It's incredibly imaginative too. So yeah, check out Waititi's other stuff, Jojo Rabbit, which was an Academy Award winner. And it has some of these same kind of themes to it, and that's more Nazi Germany, World War II, but still the imagination is ever present, and kind of living the story vicariously through a child is a big theme of it. I guess as far as like books, which is also a movie, Into the Wild, the movie was directed by Sean Penn in 2007, and I totally blanked with the author and the year it came out. I saw the movie. I haven't read the book, but that was one that a lot of people used to come into the bookstore and request. But I would be completely remiss if I did not recommend one of arguably the best movies ever made. Are you ready?
No, not ready.
Jurassic Park. Come on.
Oh,
dude,
sure.
you knew that was coming. You knew that was coming. But
Seriously? I mean, I guess
Come
because
on.
there's they share a actor, one singular actor.
oh my
right?
God. All right, pump the brakes there. Let me just sell it to you for a second. First of all, Spielberg's films deal with a lot of this father-son family dynamic, right? Even if I could say Jaws would be another really good one to get into that of what it means to be a father, maybe a reluctance to be a father. And I think Sam Neill in Jurassic Park, that really addresses that. It's also a pretty feminist film too. But and then, you do have some wilderness survival, whether it's accurate or not. I think maybe not so much, but still really fun. And yeah, it's just a romp, not so much a comedy, but boy, is it a good movie. So there you go.
Clearly, Waititi is uber influenced by Spielberg. Like anyone is who wants to make films like he does, which are for all age groups, have some dark elements, have some scary elements, have some funny elements, slapstick, everything involved, and it's that's what Spielberg is, and I see Waititi doing his homage to that, like I said, 80s thing too, like the best 80s movie that didn't actually come out of the 80s.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, thank you guys so much for taking the time to watch this movie, to talk about it, to get super nerdy. Alan, thank you for letting us know how to survive in the wild. I'm looking forward to taking a class with you because now I'm not as terrified of the woods. I have a tarp, so I think I'm good.
Yeah, all you need is a tarp,
That's
right,
it,
Alan?
that's
That's what I heard.
We're going to quote you on that.
And I was going to go out and try to kill a boar with a knife earlier or later today. but
It's
I
on
think
my
I'm gonna
to-do
change my
list.
plans.
Yeah,
As long as you record it, I guess. I'll
Right.
watch it later.
yeah. Well, and thank you again to the Grand Rapids Public Library for not only all of the services that are offered for free, such as Canopy, where you can go watch this film, Hunt for the Wilderpeople, the 2016 film by Taika Waititi, but thank you to the Grand Rapids Public Library Foundation, which supports different programs like this, educational resources and such. Really amazing that we can be part of that. We're truly honored. And thanks to the Community Media Center, which houses not only Wealthy Theater, we have WYC 88.1 FM, GRTV, our public access station, The Rapidian is our online news platform, as well as we have IT services for nonprofits. And our general mission is this idea of media literacy, which I think we accomplished today. We dissect films or books or anything like that and try to find the subtext and, what makes it tick. So that's why, of course, we signed on for this. So looking forward to the next conversation. But until then, thank you guys. It's been real.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.